Good afternoon. Today, we have decided to raise the key rate by 50 basis points to 5.5% per annum. As inflationary pressure has notably strengthened, we need to ensure price stability consistently and actively. We see the necessity of further increases in the key rate at upcoming meetings. Let me dwell on the factors behind today's decision. First, the Russian economy will return to its pre-crisis level during this quarter. Its first half of the year growth exceeds the pace we factored in the April forecast. Leaving out restrictions on oil production and international passenger travel, it is clear that the output in most key industries has not only bounced back to the end 2019 level, but outstripped it. Russia is among the group of countries that will be the first to reach the pre-pandemic level of output. It is typical of the current situation in many sectors of the economy that growth in demand is outpacing the potential to expand supply. Companies need time to roll out new capacities and also hire and train staff. Demand is growing both domestically and abroad. The activation of external demand is underpinned by a faster than previously anticipated rebound in the global economy and trade. The main reasons are abating epidemic risks, given vaccination rates and extremely loose monetary and fiscal policies in major economies. The aggregate demand is also affected by the elevated growth rates of raw materials and component inventories. Firstly, companies make up for the drop in inventories incurred during the pandemic and as a result of disrupted logistical chains. Secondly, in light of the last year's experience, companies are seeking to accumulate more inventories to ensure against possible disruptions in supplies, as well as further price increases. These processes concern a broad range of production chains rather than a narrow group of goods. The structure of demand is also changing as a result of changes in people's way of life due to the pandemic. Neither the sustainability nor the duration of this process is clear so far. Yet, it evidently creates bottlenecks on the supply side. For instance, massive work and study from home spurred a sharp increase in the need for telecommunications, followed by a considerable increase in the demand for microchips. Online orders require much more packaging materials. A pickup in demand for real estate is in part associated with a desire to reach comfortable conditions for working from home. Wishing to support their economies, many countries are expanding infrastructure projects. All this also influences the increase in demand for construction materials and metals. It is still difficult for businesses to assess which part of the elevated demand is temporary and which sustainable. They need time to make decisions about investing in new production facilities. Moreover, these decisions may be postponed given the large-scale changes concerning the regulation of greenhouse gas emissions and corporate taxation. These transformations can significantly change the economic situation in many industries and the return on investment in them. Such uncertainty is able of decelerating capacity expansion globally. In these conditions, the aggregate supply will be less elastic, responding less flexibly to the pickup in demand, even over the mid-term horizon compared to previous years. Coupled with the accommodative monetary policy and fiscal policy of major economies, all these factors strengthen the risk that the acceleration of inflation, both in this country and in the majority of other countries, is of a more sustainable nature than perceived at first glance. In the Russian economy, demand is growing energetically and sustainably. This is especially noticeable in the non-food segment. People continue to actively buy household appliances, construction materials and furniture. The change in car sales is a clear manifestation of the pickup in domestic demand. In recent months, their sales have exceeded the 2018 level, which was a record high compared to 2014. The sales of apartments have increased considerably. To finance these large purchases, people use their savings, including money saved due to restrictions on foreign tourism, and take out more loans. In the services sector, the recovery has not yet completed, mainly due to remaining anti-pandemic restrictions. The demand for labor is bouncing back, with some industries noting a certain deficit of labor force. This is associated both with borders closed for labor migrants and with the expansion of several industries' need to hire more staff than before the pandemic. The annual growth of nominal wages remains within the range of recent years. Accommodative monetary policy was required to ensure a faster return to demand to its pre-pandemic level and to restore output. Once recovery is completed, supply cannot keep pace with further fast expansion in demand. Therefore, accommodative monetary policy would continue to step up inflation rather than expand output. This brings us directly to the second factor underlying our today's decision. Inflation becomes a growing concern. In May, annual price growth rates reached 6%, considerably exceeding the target level. The current inflationary pressure has intensified. The average 3-month, from March to May, seasonally adjusted price growth peaked up to a maximum since January 2016. Similar trends are observed for other indicators of price dynamics under our consideration. It does not seem correct to attribute this elevated price growth exclusively to the impact of transitory supply-side factors, in particular global price movements. Let me remind you that this explanation was the main one when prices picked up in Q4 last year. At that moment, doubts indeed persisted as to the sustainable nature of demand recovery given the ongoing pandemic. Nonetheless, even then, we aired fears that the rise in inflation expectations driven by these external shocks might transform one-off pro-inflationary factors into sustainable ones. We may see now that in recent months the pro-inflationary impact of demand has become prevailing. The fundamental difference of the so-called cost inflation from demand inflation is how it influences the physical volumes of consumption. In case of cost inflation, that is supply shock, prices are growing, but consumers have to buy less in response. Businesses can only partially translate their costs into prices as demand is limited. Whereas if both prices and sales volumes grow, and this is exactly what we're seeing now across quite a few market segments, it means that the expansion in demand is by far exceeding the impact of supply-side factors. Therefore, it means that we're facing demand inflation. Finally, elevated inflation expectations do make a considerable contribution to inflation. In anticipation of price increases, consumers are ready to start buying earlier than they previously planned. Thus, given the unanchored expectations, even transitory price spikes may become more sustainable. Why is the acceleration of inflation posing a threat? It is more difficult for companies to stick to their business plans, predict financial flows, and hedge against volatility. It is the most vulnerable citizens that are hardest hit by inflation. Low-income families spend increasingly more funds on essential goods. High inflation boosts inequality, lowers social security, and undermines the financial standing of most families. That is why our main task is to stabilize price growth as soon as possible by curbing inflation expectations and not allowing an inflationary spiral to exacerbate. According to our estimates, annual inflation is expected to be higher than we forecast in April, but lower than its current level. Due to the high base effect in the first half of this year, annual inflation will return to the target only in the second half next year. Third, monetary conditions remain accommodative. Interest rates on loans and deposits are low as compared to current and expected inflation. Our decisions to raise the key rate in March and April have not yet been fully reflected in banks' interest rates. Banks' lending and deposit rates are closely connected with yields on government bonds, OFZs. OFZs are risk-free ruble assets for banks, and the pricing of all other ruble products of banks is pegged to them. OFZs yields with various maturities change together with the key rate, though to a different extent. The key rate impacts to the most extent the yields on short-term OFZs, with maturities of up to 2-3 years. These yields have increased significantly over the past 2 months. They will impact the cost of short-term loans and also deposit rates, which have already started rising. Meanwhile, yields on long-term OFZs are largely determined by long-term inflation expectations, the assessment of the macroeconomic policy stability, and external environment. The cost of long-term financing of investment projects, as well as mortgage loan rates, depend precisely on the yields on long-term OFZs. Pursuing monetary policy to stabilize inflation and raising the key rate to achieve this, the Bank of Russia curbs growth in long-term interest rates in the economy. This quarter experiences a good illustration of the above. Despite the increase in the key rate on 3 occasions since last March, for a total of 125 basis points, the yields of long-term OFZs are currently on the same level as in late March. As far as the pace of lending growth is concerned, it remains high both in corporate and particularly in retail segments. Thus, mortgages are rising by more than 25% year-on-year. In addition, retail loans are heating consumer demand. We are also concerned by the fact that lending is growing due to loans to borrowers with a high debt burden. Therefore, we resume pre-pandemic macroprudential add-ons on unsecured loans from 1st of July and on mortgage loans with a low down payment and a high debt-to-income ratio of borrowers from August. The Bank of Russia will stand ready to further increase macroprudential add-ons to prevent the accumulation of systemic risks and to ensure financial stability. Since our meeting in April, the balance of risks has tilted even more towards pro-inflationary risks. Elevated inflation expectations as a response to high inflation and low interest rates still pose a major risk. With fears of future price growth, people tend to spend more today and save less for tomorrow. This makes prices grow even more rapidly. Disinflationary risks look weaker. They are connected with, firstly, a faster reopening of borders. In this case, domestic demand may partly shift to imports of tourism services, easing domestic demand-side pressure on prices. Secondly, if the pandemic deteriorates, depending on the pace of vaccination and the spread of new coronavirus strains, the global economy will grow much more slowly. Thirdly, a bumper harvest may cause inflation to slow down. As far as monetary policy prospects are concerned, we are prepared to step up actions needed to bring inflation back to the target. As I have already mentioned, the Board of Directors sees the necessity of further increases in the key rate at upcoming meetings. We will determine the scope and pace of increasing the key rate based on our assessment of the level of sustained inflationary pressure, the time frame for inflation expectation stabilization, as well as the forecast of further movements of aggregate demand and supply. Our monetary policy will ensure annual inflation to return to the near 4% target in the second half of 2022. Thank you for your attention, and now I am ready to answer your questions. The first question comes from Elena Fabricna, Reuters. What kind of inflation the regulator is expecting to see based on the results of 2021, taking into account the practical data, actual data coming for May, and whether the assessment for the average key rate for this year changed? Possibly central bank can envisage an easier switch into the area of a tougher policy. Like I've previously stated, based on the results of 2021, we expect to see inflation lower than the current level, the annual inflation, but apparently it is going to be above the forecast inflation range for 2021 that we came out with in April, but an updated digital forecast we will offer in July, because we will have a core board meeting, and of course we will update all of our forecasts. As far as the average key rate for this year is concerned, we similarly would update it in our forecast, but it is going to be apparently higher than in the previous one. And as far as the switch to tougher policy is concerned, we do not rule out moving into a restraint policy. We didn't rule it out previously, but the probability in our mind currently is stronger, although this is not inevitable. It will all depend upon the kind of dynamics and in the economics and the inflation and the inflationary expectations. Next questions from Maria Stepanova, TASS Agency. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Could you please comment on the announced changes in the mortgage rules, which have exemptions norms in it, and don't you rule out that it might lead into the bubble in the mortgage market? Thank you very much for the question. Yes, indeed, it took us a long time about how to transform the exemptions mortgage offerings, and the kind of solution that has been proposed we view as a very balanced one. What it may lead to, it may lead on the one hand to this effect upon the spiking demand and pricing to cool down a little bit, and the exit from the program that we previously considered as an anti-crisis one. And I shall repeat that the mortgage program with exemptions was very effective as an anti-crisis measure, but you got similarly to a timely exit from it. You can't do it overnight, because that may lead to very dramatic change of terms and conditions, as well as demand, which is slightly overheated by now. But nevertheless, for example, reducing the marginal size of the loan down to 3 million rubles, we believe will reduce such a strong overheated demand in the leading cities. Because if you may recall, we previously proposed regional principle to select the regions, but we do understand that in between the regions, situation may be quite different, where prices may grow very speedily in major urban centers, and while in smaller townships that may not happen, and there may not be sufficient demand, because this market is quite local in nature. And so being able to regulate it through the marginal size of the exemptions loan is quite correct. And so raising this rate for these kind of loans up to 7% will bring the rate down to the market level, which is also quite important. Similarly important in this decision is that the purpose-specific individual support measures are going to be more broadened, because individual families, and that would help to support the mortgage activity. We on our side are going to be quite watchful of the quality of such loans, and if need be, to employ the macroprudential regulation measures so as to make sure that the quality of lending as well as borrowing could be respective, and so that uncontrolled debt burdens wouldn't be brought upon the citizens. Next question comes from Anastasia Saveleva, Interfax. We can't hear you. Yes, good afternoon. All right, Anastasia Saprikina from RIA Novosti. The Bank of Russia today toughens its message with respect to the Q rate and sees the need to further raise it in the upcoming meetings. What's the potential of further increase the regulator sees, and what should be the level of inflation expectations in order not to raise the rate? We will come out with the updated forecast of our view over the average annual key rate in July, but I would like to confirm that we are ready to make up our mind about our monetary policy and the key rate in such a way that will correspond to the need to bring inflation to target. And the potential of further rises depends upon what kind of data comes in and how the situation might evolve. Now, the inflation expectations, of what level they should be. Well, first of all, it must start demonstrating stable decline, because currently we believe that the inflation expectations, there's a bit of a ups and downs in between different months. In May, they have been a little bit lower than in April, but in the meantime, we do not acknowledge the stable trend for the inflation expectation to subside, and we're very much concerned by the fact that the inflation expectations do remain at an elevated level and has been remaining for a few months, for more than half a year as a minimum, and that, of course, strengthens the probability of secondary effects. Next question from Alexei Birikov Andrei from Bloomberg. Good afternoon, Elvira Nabiullina. I've got one question. Just one specific question in terms of the tough monetary policy. You said that the chance to switch to it are much stronger. Do I understand correctly that you mean that it may happen this year? And if there is a high chance for a moderate, tough monetary policy to remain for a longer period of time, since you expect, as you said, the inflation to be brought to target in the second half of the year. And the second question about the National Welfare Fund. The Minister of Finance announced that they will exclude US dollar from its asset list. Do we understand correctly that now the central bank, as tasked by the Ministry of Finance, is going to be buying in the FX market only euros and RMBs? And what will happen to gold? Will central bank be buying gold for the Ministry of Finance and take it from its reserves and put it into the accounts of National Welfare Fund? With respect to the moderate tough monetary policies, the probability has strengthened, but when exactly it will happen, within which period of time, we're not able to say. I mean, the probability is there, but it hasn't yet been predetermined. Now, the time frame, the scale, the pace of the key rate to be increased, we will define depending upon the situation and the way the inflationary expectation manifests itself. Now, with respect to the currency structure changes in the National Welfare Fund, I would like to note that because of the Ministry of Finance transactions, as part of the fiscal rule, we acquire currency in the domestic market, and we buy both the US dollars and euros. The purchases which are necessary to make the currency structure and the gold and precious metals structure according to the standards with regard to the currency and gold reserves. We do this in the external market. And so by managing the currency reserves, we do take into account the currency structure inside the National Welfare Fund, because this is our commitment before the Minister of Finance. But this is not the only driver. I would like to remind you that the amount of the currency and precious metals reserves in National Welfare Fund account just for 1/5 of it, so we will definitely bearing in mind. But purchasing gold, because of the changes in the structure of the National Welfare Fund, is something that we don't plan to do in the domestic market. There's no need for that. Anastasia Savelli from Interfax, once again, good afternoon. Yes, once again, good afternoon. Do we understand correctly that at this point in time, the rate increase in July looks inevitable. And so the whole question is just about how high, and is there a probability of a bit of a pause in terms of the July board meeting, considering the possible worsening of the epidemiological situation in Russia? And what are the ranges of the neutral passage, considering the current inflation level? And another question, what kind of inflation do you expect at the peak of the process, and when will it happen? Do you still expect that it will start slowing down in autumn? Thank you very much for your questions. Now, as far as raising the rate in July, yes, with a high probability, one should say, but of course one shouldn't exclude the possible interval because our life is much richer than all kinds of forecasts, and it may come back at us with all kinds of unforeseeable circumstances, even the kind that may require us to take a break. We don't rule that out, but with high probability there may be another increase. And as far as the neutrality range is concerned, a very good question. It is, because you may all recall in our time we defined the neutral range as 5-6% in nominal terms. In a situation when inflation is close to our target, which is 4%, and respectively, the release is at the potential benchmark, which means 1 to 2% in real terms. But when inflation is higher, the short-term neutral rate may be higher than the rate level. But our perception of the long-term neutral rate hasn't changed. And to assess the need to change it right now is difficult, quite difficult. Now, with respect to the peak rate, when? It's hard to say right now what exactly the peak inflation may look like. We will see what it is with regard to the inflation dynamics, may be a little bit higher than the current level. So in our mind, the inflation will start going down in the autumn, and this will happen because of two factors. First, the base effect, and secondly, the impact from our monetary policy. Because the kind of inflation that we're having now, the annual inflation, it has emerged under the influence of the monetary conditions of the economy during the key rate at 4.25%. You remember that we act with a lag, and so to decide on the key rate in March, whatever we decided then, hasn't yet fully reflected itself in the banking rates and in the inflation respectively, but this effect will manifest itself in time. And so it already is demonstrating itself because we do discern it in terms of various deposit rates and the way they move. But these effects, considering the decision make, will gradually appear, and we think that what it would lead to is the inflation going down starting in autumn. But because of various statistical effects, i.e. that for a long period of time the monetary conditions were quite accommodative, in the course of the year the inflation may nudge up a little bit some more. Now, the next question comes from Dmitry Butrin, Kommersant. What do you believe are the reasons behind the very slow price growth in the service sector? Are there any factors which condition this dynamic outside of purely pandemic factors? Well, first of all, the price dynamics in service sector, particularly in some of the segments, is very pronounced. If we take a look at the hospitality business, and when we saw the May inflation, which is different as opposed to the weekly inflation, that, amongst other things, was brought about by a very dramatic price increase in the hospitality business, which in the monthly inflation reflected stronger. And with regard to the services, largely speaking, the price dynamics, it is quite absorbed, and so the problem of fixating, prices at the time when many operators in the service sector were closed. On top of it, there remain a number of restrictions in the service sector in various regions, which, as you described, is an epidemic factor. But nevertheless, what we do see that as far as the household services is concerned, the hotel services, healthcare services, and so on and so forth, in many segments, the prices currently are growing faster than 4%. Next question comes from Artur Arutuno from Forbes. Good afternoon, Elvira Nabiullina. Another question about National Welfare Fund. Will Central Bank change the structure of gold and currency reserves on behalf of Minister of Finance? You already mentioned that the decision about the gold and currency reserve hasn't been commented, but maybe you already have ones that you can describe to us. Well, first of all, with respect to our plans about how we are going to change the structure of currency and gold reserves, we never make them public because the currency and gold reserve data we publish with 6-month lag. Why? Because we're one of the big players in the international market, in the market for reserve assets. So when making our decisions, nevertheless, we do take into account the current structure of National Welfare Fund and the way it evolves. We do bear it in mind, but at the same time, like I said, this is just one of a set of factors because the National Welfare Fund accounts for just 1/5 of the gold and currency reserves in it. But at the same time, in 2018, we all instituted main changes into the structure of our gold and currency reserves. Next question comes from Roman Markelov, the Russian Gazette. Does the Bank of Russia support broad plans to de-dollarize the Russian economy and the financial system? Will the central bank offer new initiatives aimed to this end? Will there be a complete giving up on US dollar in international reserves? Will the share of other assets be growing in it considerably? In which currencies favor the choice may be made then, euro, RMB or gold? As far as de-dollarization is concerned, we have already been pursuing the de-dollarization policy in the financial system throughout many years, and not only with respect to the Russian system, but the Russian economy in general. And the monetary policy, which is aimed at providing for a sustainably low inflation and support the de-dollarization of the Russian economy, because quite often before then, the various people would switch into foreign currency, simply being afraid of their savings denominated in Russian rubles losing value. So the inflation targeting in itself as the mode of action and low inflation do make the Russian currency more attractive. Secondly, we were pursuing very specifically the policy to de-dollarize the banking balances through differentiated regulation of reserves and adequacy standards. And we do see that such changes were happening and continue to happen. If you take a look at the data since 2016, since the beginning of that year, for example, the share of currency liabilities towards the corporate customers has shrunk significantly from about 49% it was, and right now it's a little bit over 35. Same thing happened to the currency deposits held by households. The decline there even much more pronounced by about 9 percentage points since the beginning of 2016. In the same token, the share of currency-denominated loans went down for corporates because when the household basically don't take any currency loans, but the corporates do demonstrate a decline by about 14%. Well, clearly, currency lending continues to exist, and many entities do require currency borrowings. But nevertheless, there is a very clear trend towards de-dollarization that is notable. Now, with respect to our reserves, Like I mentioned, the basic changes were instituted back in 2018, and these changes emanated from us taking into account both the yields as well as liquidity behind different reserve assets, but the resilience and reliability at the same time, not only taking into account financial and economic risk, but the risk of non-economic nature. We do not intend to fully give up on US dollars, but nevertheless, the currency structure of our reserves, without doubt, does reflect different sorts of risks, including of non-economic origin. Anastasia Stogny, the bell. Yes, good afternoon, thank you very much. I've got a practical question. You yourself are quite often saying that at the stock market there are so many private investors, and one may say quite a few have come out into it quite recently. What kind of conclusions they should derive from the current rate increase and from the overall trend that raises the key rate and inflation growth? What this might mean for small retail investors? Well, the fact that investors came into the stock market, on the one hand, this is a really good thing because that expands the possibility for the people to invest money into diverse instruments, not only into the banking deposit, but also into different financial instruments. But here, what is crucial is for them to be secure and protected as investors so that they could be fully aware what kind of securities that they invest into, what one should expect from them, what kind of risks they are ready to take. And so such a massive inflow into the stock market was related not only to individuals expanding their investment opportunities, but that the deposit rates in their minds lost attraction, because the banking deposit is also another financial instrument, but the one that could be the least risky and least secure, because there is deposit insurance arrangement, and of course then raising the key rate and lowering inflation will produce the kind of an effect that the banking deposits will grow in attraction. The next question comes from Pavel Kazanowski, RBK. Hello. Central Bank continuously changes its forecast in terms of going back to 4% level. What will be central bank doing if it will become apparent that it won't be possible to come back to 4% by 2022? Is it possible for the rate to go out of the upper range of the neutral passage? And will it be possible for you to reconsider the neutral range? Well, it is true that we are updating our inflation forecasts. The forecast update, one may say, is a very everyday run-of-the-mill kind of activity, because we do it 4 times a year, because situation evolves. We're not a centrally planned economy, we're a market economy, and the market drivers very often change trends, both in economics, inflation expectations. So it is quite normal to update one's forecast as new data becomes available. Now, what the central bank will do once it sees that the inflation is not back to 4% by 2022, as we expect now, we will adjust our monetary policy, and if there are risks of a high inflationary pressure and for it to be more sustainable, then the rate may be raised even higher. Now, is it possible for the rate to move outside of the upper range of the neutral range, and under what conditions? Well, this is a question about whether the moderately tough monetary policy should be, because we don't rule it out, as long as we require inflation to go back to 4% level, and if the inflationary pressure strengthens, if the inflationary expectations do not start to go down. I mean, the neutral range, the long-term assessment of the neutral range is something that we haven't yet reconsidered, but we will describe in detail our approaches, as always, in the main guidelines of our monetary policy document, which we are starting to put together, and by autumn we will make it available. Vladimir Peshkov, Premier from the Vologda city. Good afternoon, Elvira Sahibzadovna. Yeah, prices are continuously growing, like you've mentioned already. and it is becoming more and more difficult for businesses to survive with a high added value. What are the measures do you believe could be most effectively support manufacturing sector, and does the central bank plan to change its monetary policy in order to support the manufacturing sector? Thank you. We are confident that with our policy of supporting stable inflation at relatively low levels do make a positive contribution into the development of the manufacturing sector in this country's economy. One of the outcomes of our policy to curb inflation should be and will be the stability of long-term interest rates, something that I described in my presentation, as well as the availability of long-term finance. We do see it, for example, judging by the way the mortgage lending is actively developing, something that became possible not only to various exemptions program. It has been and had been active in the pre-pandemic period because long-term rates became much more stable and the availability of long-term financial resources grew. Now, if one is to change the monetary policy, and what is being most often proposed, to reduce the rate without taking any heed of the inflation rate, in our mind, inflation then will continue strengthening and growing. Households again will lose any faith in rubles. The economy will continue absorbing more and more hard currency, and there won't be any long-term loans, the ones that the manufacturing sector requires. Low inflation is the biggest driver behind the availability of lending. And if the high inflation persists, the reduction of the key rate most definitely won't make available the kind of a lending activity that is required to increase productivity, to introduce innovation, something that manufacturing sector requires in the first place. So what we come from is that by reducing the inflationary premium that is sitting inside the rate structure, by pursuing our monetary policy, we specifically make the interest rates more and more affordable. Next question, Anna Kaledina from Izvestia. Is there any assessment of the impact upon inflation of a possible opening of many travel destinations for the coming summer? In the meantime, we do not see that many traveling destinations, I mean the ones which are abroad, because domestically all destinations are open. In the meantime, we do not see this happening. But of course, we do take it into account as one possible risk in the base scenario, because if such destinations are available, that would bring about a disinflationary effect. To assess what it will be is a bit difficult, but as a potential disinflationary factor, we do note it. Next question comes from Anna Lazareva, Russia 24. Good afternoon. Good afternoon, Elvira Nabiullina. On more than one occasion, you regulated the regulation of prices for goods in Russia. This week, China started regulating prices for industrial goods. Should one expect that the government will start introducing more and more measures like that, which would mean that they would attain a longer-term nature, including this country? And what will be the central bank's response to such a probability? Well, we do indeed see in a number of countries, although I must say that this is not a very common practice, to stop price growth. I mean, the attempts to stop price growth through administrative regulation. This is rather a response to growing global prices for some of the goods, the commodities in the first place. So, in our mind, it is possible as a short-term solution, but the administrative regulation, in time, it stretches the price effect, because one should definitely have the supply adjust to demand. And so expanding the administrative regulation areas may lead to some negative consequences, i.e., product shortages may emerge, and so on and so forth. Next question comes from Evgeny Virikov from Komsomolskaya Pravda. Good afternoon. On average, the inflation is 6%. However, some of the goods have become dozens and dozens of percentages more expensive. For example, construction materials. Will the prices fall on construction materials in the future? Does the central bank has any expectations about it? Thank you. Indeed, against the fact that the general inflation level is above our target level, which is, like 6%. But inside this inflation range, there are certain goods with respect to which prices have been growing very rapidly. We do not forecast individual categories, but I may say that overall, if the level of prices is lower and the overall inflation level is lower, then with regards to the individual categories, there will be less of an opportunity to reflect the cost growth in price growth. So such a multiple price changes for a number of goods we believe to be of a temporary nature, specifically in as far as the construction materials are concerned, like what you mentioned, because we did notice that in the monthly inflation for May, it really accounted for quite a portion of it, which, amongst other things, was related to the real estate sales boom. We previously expressed our concern with the fact that the demand for a mortgage real estate led to a very active demand, but in some adjacent sectors like the furniture and construction materials that also follow suit. And so that brings about the price growth if the supply is late to adjust itself. So a large part of inflation comes from the demand. Next question, please. Irina Vasnetsova, Stolica C, newspaper from the Mordovia Republic. What do you think? Should prices for all of the food product should be made regulated by the government? Will this reduce inflation? Well, that is a bit of an extension of the previous question about the share of regulated prices. A short question, it won't. And once again, such a temporary price administration is only capable of extending in time the ability for prices to adjust themselves to, for some goods, to what the supply shows. But if you continue to fix prices for an extended period of time at the level which is lower than what is required in order for the supply and demand to reach equilibrium, then there may turn out to be a black market and a deficit. That is exactly the kind of an outcome that you can see in the central planned economy with regulated prices at the government level, like what we are saying, to establish regulated prices at the government level for all of the food products. Well, I suppose that not everybody may recall, but many of us do remember very vividly the experience of the last few years of the USSR when the official prices were registered, and one could say that there was no inflation, but in that period of time it was impossible to meet the demand under the official prices. But the prices of the black market, there was no official statistics, but households could see in their everyday life how the prices were spiraling hectically, and that was a huge hidden inflation. But in our mind, deficit is much more dangerous than inflation, because if we are having inflation when continuously pursuing the monetary policy of targeting inflation, the inflation is going to go back to the target level exactly as it has been happening during the past 5 years. And if there is a shortage of some sort of a product in an administrative pricing, it won't disappear, because artificially lowered level of prices in an administrative regulation doesn't create enough incentives for producers and manufacturers to raise productivity, to expand their production, and that would create an extremely negative impact, such administrative regulation of prices. Next question, Andrei Ostrov from Reuters. Good afternoon. Does the Bank of Russia note the inflow of money into the ruble because of the growing rate, which makes the carry trade transactions more attractive, and for how long this may last? Thank you. Speaking about our today's response in the currency market, we really don't see any tangible agitation because our decision in many ways coincided with the market expectations. But overall, the high rate does make the ruble assets more attractive. Now, in terms of any large-scale risk of a large-scale carry trade, we don't discern it here. Thank you. Tatiana Chubasova, Interfax, good afternoon. Yes, good afternoon. The recently ended St. Petersburg International Forum demonstrated a strong interest towards green financing. Almost every second session was dedicated to this wonderful topic. Everybody became green, and everybody is asking from the central bank certain regulatory easing, because otherwise, as it turns out, for the banks to invest into the green social lending to be a bit of a charity, because there's no premium on top of it apart from a reputation. What, in theory, the central bank could offer a kind of easing to the banks in as far as reducing the risk ratios or impairment standards. The second question, the recent central bank raised the question about the regulating of their financial holdings and prepared their respective legal draft, because the topic was raised when the Discovery Bank had a problem and the holding that was in its ownership. But several years down the road now, and there aren't any major cases like that. Now, why does central bank currently demonstrates having such ideas? Are there any risks about there being some kind of holdings or official or unofficial who are buying en masse the National Pension Fund stocks and thus generate risks? Thank you. As far as the ESG agenda, the green agenda is concerned, honestly, globally, this topic came out starting from the risk analysis as a result of the climate change. And this is the kind of policy that ought to be pursued so as to take these risks into account, so as to mitigate these risks, both for the economy and the households, and in the case of the financial industry, which funds the economic development, this is also quite important. So we do believe that this would have been extremely erroneous to say that we are starting to ease things only based on the level of being green. It is all about correct assessment of risks because of the climate change. These are systemic risks, and the proper assessment of those must lead to the so-called Brown Project and the Brown operators to be properly assessed and risk analyzed, and that's what we're talking about, being able to set such risk and what kind of strict regulation may be required. And there aren't any ongoing statistical indicators that may demonstrate how these risks manifest themselves, how they affect the default performance. But we run stress tests, we run different scenarios in order for such risks to expose them, as well as to assess the quality of the green project. And together with the financial institutions, we're going to consider this. We're not meaning that as long as there's a green label being attached, that's when the money is going to be made available. We are talking about specific risks that the financial market should follow. And so actually, not only funding green project is important to us, I would like to very much emphasize, but funding the transformation projects or the transformation bonds. It's like when the companies or operators who are not sufficiently green may have the ability to fund their transition. It is not the least important task compared to funding a purely green project. Now, as far as regulating financial holdings are concerned, this is indeed a very complex topic, and it's going not so easily. Many issues, quite a lot of resistance to it. However, nevertheless, there is an issue like that, but we don't see any immediate risks here for any super urgent regulation to be brought around. I would rather say that it should be regulated within the context of an ecosystem, which means certain new forms of interpenetration between the financial and non-financial business, because these has to be transparent. All the risks must be clearly identified, and we need to take these risks into account in our regulation. So I would rather put an emphasis upon us requiring to develop approaches towards proper regulation of ecosystems so that on the one hand they could develop further, which as to provide convenience both for the people and for the businesses, but we must be aware of all of the risks and reflect them respectively in our regulation. Elena Nikolicheva, St. Petersburg TV channel. Yeah, good afternoon. Because of the changes in the exemptions mortgage lending, do you believe that the gap between the real estate price growth and inflation may shrink? And if so, to what extent? Well, such a gradual coming out of the anti-crisis exemptions mortgage lending and switching towards the very individual and consumer-specific mortgage lending is called upon to cool down the agitated demand so that the real estate prices would grow at a much more slower pace, because the gap right now between the real estate price growth and inflation is quite material, and we believe that such measures indeed should create a greater equilibrium in between the supply and demand, which in its turn will reduce the pressure upon real estate prices. Anastasia Saveleva from Interfax once again. Yes, once again, good afternoon. My question is such whether at today's board meeting the central bank didn't consider the possibility of raising the rate by 75 or maybe even 100 basis points. And would you agree to what the Minister of Finance was saying, that the high annual inflation is one of the indicators of an overheated situation? Will the central bank be strong enough by itself to combat inflation, or maybe you require fiscal support? And won't you explain to everybody where is it that you're going to buy gold from, and how are you going to coordinate your activities in as far as the reserve structure of the National Welfare Fund is concerned? Thank you. As far as the optionalities are concerned that we've discussed at the Board of Directors meeting, there were different proposals, 0.25, 0.75 as well, but we discussed elaborately the possibility to raise it by 0.5 in 1 percentage points. Various arguments have been voiced for and against. Now, why we didn't make a larger step compared to 0.5, 50 basis points, although once again I shall confirm that we went into quite a lengthy debate about it. First of all, one should give time to the economy to adjust to the financial system, to adjust to changes in the key rate, and respectively the monetary terms should also change. And secondly, we need more time in order to be able to assess the effect that is already out there and will continue to emerge from the previously raised rates, and we need to have more statistics in our hands. By July, we will have the statistics for the June inflation, as well as the June-July inflationary expectations, itemization of the GDP in between the first quarter. So May is also a very special month, although we do consider all of the performance indicators considering the seasonality, but that is a bit of a holiday-making month, and so one should also include into the assessment June and July. Now, as far as the Minister of Finance is concerned and the danger of the economy overheating itself, yes, the stimulus fiscal policy basically does generate pro-inflationary effects, and against all other things being equal, the greater public spending may lead to a higher key rate and a much tougher monetary policy. Undoubtedly, we make up our minds about the monetary policy considering the fiscal spending as well as the budget deficit and the way the fiscal policy is evolving, because this is a very important factor that we rely upon. But the inflationary policy measures and inflationary targeting will enable us to bring back inflation to its target. Nevertheless, once again, I shall underscore the incentivizing fiscal policy does carry pro-inflationary effect. And that is why we support the government policy to go back to the fiscal rule completely and entirely by 2022. Now, as far as gold is concerned, in the gold and currency reserve, we've got quite a sufficient amount of gold, and therefore, in as far as growing the portion of gold in the National Welfare Fund structure, we do bear this in mind, but there's no excessive need for that purpose to start buying gold in the domestic market. And so the amount of gold that the Bank of Russia has is considerably exceeds the amount of gold acquired by the National Welfare Fund. Next question comes from Anastasia Steplikina from RIA Novosti. The Bank of Russia on more than one occasion said that the rates of economic recovery take place faster than expectations. Can the economy grow at a faster pace than the forecast of about 3 to 4%? How do you assess the contribution made by the vaccination into the economic growth? We expect that the economy will recover in the current quarter. The April forecast in terms of the GDP growth for this year was at 3 to 4%. In July, we're going to review it, and most probably we will upgrade the assessment of the GDP growth for this year. But here, the question is not rather how quickly the economy will recover, but how quickly it may grow after the recovery. And so it is quite important for that growth not to be based on inflation, but for the economic potential, the true potential to grow. Because the fact of the matter is to consider that the GDP growth forecast at 3 to 4% within the midterm outlook can be brought about by the inflation growth, I would say, is not very correct. This may be dangerous because we need to improve the productivity of labor and the economic potential in order for the economic growth to be sustainable. With regards to the vaccination and its contribution to the GDP growth, vaccination, it creates a herd immunity, and it will bear a positive effect upon growth. Well, first of all, the remaining restrictions may be lifted, which remain in a number of sectors, including the service sector. And secondly, it may, may reduce the probability of subsequent waves of the pandemic that may lead to additional restrictions placed upon the economy, because you know that some are afraid of various strains and variants and certain new epidemic waves that may come. And of course, vaccination is an absolutely necessary measure in order to create the population immunity. And investors, along with that, will have a higher level of trust towards the Russian economy. I mean, the Russian investors and foreign investors, if there is such a herd immunity around, because overall that would very much improve the investment attraction. Thank you very much. That was the last question. Thank you very much for your attention.